All right, what's up, y'all? Welcome. Today, it's something unique, something that you didn't expect, something where we throw you a curveball once again. We love throwing curveballs over here. We got with us almost Dr. Tim Gordon, correct?
Yeah, what's up?
I
What's
want
up,
to go
Jay?
ahead and call you Dr. Tim, but that's coming soon, right?
Yeah, and then I'm gonna have doctor surgically implanted onto my name, Tim. So you'll
Oh,
have to always say
whoa.
Dr. Tim Gordon, like Dr. Taylor Marshall.
If you get a medical doctorate too, do we get to call you Dr. Tim Marshall? I mean,
Dr. Well,
Dr. Tim
Gordon.
Gordon, not
um,
Marshall. Sorry.
yeah. Uh yeah, and also I'm a Juris Doctor. So if I were in England, that would count. But yeah, it really doesn't matter. It's pretty fake and gay to use. Uh anyway. So I
You
just say, call me Tim.
basically
People.
would have a alphabet behind your name. Like you would be like the most authoritative dude in any field possible, right? We just
That's right.
cite you and the argument's over. When you get all these JD, DD, Dr. DD, THD. Anyway, I'm just being silly. Welcome to the show, Tim Gordon. How you doing, man?
Thanks. How are you, Jay? I'm well.
I'm great. Yeah, you're quickly becoming my favorite Roman Catholic.
Oh,
And
thanks.
that's a small barrel to choose from because we don't have many Roman Catholics that hang out with us anymore. So it's an honored, treasured prize to have as my favorite Roman Catholic. But
It is.
um,
Who else do you even like? No, thanks. Thanks.
well, it's
That's
not a matter
cool.
of liking. I'm just talking about in terms of people that we chat with on a regular basis. I do actually do have a handful of Tradcat friends that are still buddies of mine.
Yeah.
My buddy Dave, who's got I think he's working on his 11th or 12th kid now. So yeah, we do have friends that are trad cats. It's just that when I do a lot of streaming, there's not typically, but we always have great conversations, and I respect your research, your knowledge, and what you bring to the table. And so I wanted to have you on to discuss something that, again, I think would maybe throw people for a curveball. Areas that I don't know about. Like I had a buddy on last night, and we were talking about British history and areas I don't know a lot about British history. I don't know a whole lot about the period that we're going to talk about tonight, which is this time span of Pius IX, Vatican I, the things that were kind of in an uproar in Europe, Italy at this time, and the interactions with the U.S. and what the U.S.'s attitude was to Marxism, socialism during this time period. One thing I do know, which I noticed you've been, I think, studying this recently with some of the books that you mentioned and that you showed me, is that I remember many, many years ago when I was really studying Marxism in depth that I went on Marxist.org and I happened upon this letter. It might be two or three letters exactly, but between Karl Marx and Lincoln. And so they had a kind of a kinship there. So I'll let you kick it off and you can take us wherever you want to go, because when I saw that you had been reading on this, that was the first thing I thought of.
Yeah. Consider the time period. 1861 is a big year, right? Beginning of the American Civil War. It's also the beginning of the Italian unification project. Arguably, both are one big step in the long march toward globalism. And it doesn't matter. I understand normies love Lincoln. Hopefully I can chip away at that tonight. But the point is, do as Jay said a second ago, couple in your mind Lincoln and Marx, and couple in your mind Pio Nono, Pius IX, and Jefferson Davis. There is significant correspondence back and forth between both of those couplets, and it's not insignificant. Now, normies will cope, Jay, by trying to say, oh, this most perfect friendship. That's an Aristotelian term from books 8 and 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics. This most perfect friendship that was formed between Jefferson Davis, and Pius IX was based around a shared kind of commiseration in their local situations with regard to a forced liberal nationalization project that was martially forced on them. Obviously, Pio Nono by by Garibaldi, who, as you mentioned to me, Jay, was a Mason, and of course Jeff Davis by Lincoln. And not only did Pio Nono send to Jefferson Davis a crown of thorns when he was imprisoned for 2 years after the close of the Civil War, but it was a commiseratory crown of thorns because he was the first of, I think, 4 popes. The base 4 that I wanted to talk about tonight, I got this fact just waiting to go live here. The base 4 popes I want to talk about, Pius IX, Leo XIII, Pius X, and Pius XI, all considered themselves prisoners of the Vatican. They refused to accept that which was offered to them by Unification Italy of a city-state within Rome. They said, no, we won't leave the Vatican ever. We are prisoners of the Vatican. We don't want to do anything to vindicate or even accidentally justify the false liberal Masonic nationalization of that which is local. So a term that I keep coming to, I'm trying to hit up my retrogrades and parish orphans on my channel, is the localism is to nationalism as nationalism is to globalism. Like, nationalism is better than globalism, but it's a distinction of degree. Localism is always better. And, well, I'm not trying to go too in depth right off the bat, but it's important to note that Pius IX, who was the very friendly, the most perfect friendship, the only delegate, the only world leader in the entire world to recognize Jefferson Davis as president, only one who considered him a most perfect friend. He sent him a crown of thorns, a very consoling letter. Pius IX was famous for his diplomacy and his careful statecraft. So when coping normies will say, well, yeah, he called him this, but we don't want to be in any way endorsing of the American Confederation, it's dumb. They're saying, oh, he just called him president to be polite or something, but he was the only world leader who did it. And guess what he wouldn't do? He wouldn't, in his local situation that in his mind, Pius IX, he equated to Jefferson Davis's, he would literally not even set foot outside the Vatican within, basically cross the Tiber eastwise. Then you get into Rome proper. He wouldn't accept the designation of city-state. So he was very finely attuned to nuances of statecraft. So it's a bunch of BS when they say that he was just he was lumbering through sovereign international immunity and sovereign international diplomacy by calling Jefferson Davis president. He knew what he was doing, and he very much related to him.
This is interesting. I actually did not know that. So again, we see, as I said, I knew he would bring information to the table that we didn't know. And for those in the chat that aren't aware, and Tim can correct me if he disagrees, my view is that when we think of revolutionary nationalism, this comes out of the French Revolution, and so this is not necessarily, in my view, equated with the theology that we read about in the Bible of ethnos, or kind of an indigenous native group of people. The Bible talks about that. Jesus says, go out and convert the ethnoi, right? So this is a Greek term that just means people groups. There are ancient and old nations, right? If we think about, Armenia being one of the earliest to convert, that's an ancient Christian nation. I mean, obviously now we would say they're, non-Chalcedonians or whatever, but the point being is that in my view, the ancient canons of the councils recognize the legitimacy of Christian nations. But this is not the same thing when we get to the post-Enlightenment period and the post-French Revolutionary period, because now we get a new idea of what a nation is. A nation now becomes equated with the sort of merchant class and Freemasonic approach to nationalism. And that's very prominent, very easy to see in the French Revolution, which I know that pretty well and pretty in depth. But so when Tim's talking about nationalism as a kind of a prison or something that's problematic to the vantage point of the Vatican and people like Pius IX that would be in prison in the Vatican, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that's the point here, is a lot of people, they confuse nationalism post-French Revolution with the notion of ancient nation states going back to, the ancient world even. But That's just to clear up for anybody in the audience that might be, I thought you liked, Christian states. Why you sound like you're anti-nationalist? I'm anti-French Revolution, Enlightenment nationalism.
Agreed. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I have to deal with the same thing with tradcasts that are like, oh, what's your anti-nationalism? It's like, well, no, I am a Montesquieuan on the matter, where Montesquieu believed there are three big cardinal rules for what constituted a res publica. And Aristotle says there are three good regimes. I'll go back a little further. Aristotle says there are three good regimes. I'm always with Aristotle. The best is a monarchy. It has a degraded form, which is not a common good subverting form, and that's a tyranny. The second, and that's basically rule by the few or tyranny. Rule by the one or tyranny by the one. My thoughts are scattered tonight. The second good, acceptable regime for Aristotle and the Aristotelians, including Thomas, is an aristocracy, which is a rule for the common good by the few, a rule by the few for the common good. And that has a degraded form called an oligarchy, which is a rule not for the common good by the few. And then the third acceptable or good regime is a polity or a republic, a res publica. That is a rule by the many for the good. And it has a degraded form, which Aristotle calls democracy, which is a rule by the many that has been perverted. So there's a couplet in each of these three regimes, and there's a good form. And Aristotle, Thomas, everyone in between, that I study, Catholic political intellectual tradition, says basically the mark for whether or not it's the good form on the left column in each couplet, a monarchy or an aristocracy or a polity, is whether or not there will be in place one, few, or many as rulers, what came to be called subsidiarity by Pius XI. And subsidiarity means basically that in the valences of governing spheres of power, there's inner valences that are closer and more local, and there are outward valences of power. So we go from Jefferson said, I prefer the city to the county to the state to the Fed, right? That is subsidiarity. That the right of first refusal to, I'll use 14th Amendment jurisprudence now, occupy a legislative field, the right to legislate a certain kind of morality, starts local first, and as Pius the 11th will say, only moves to the next outer valence shell if it is not within the generic legislative competency of that inner shell. In other words, most stuff should be legislated by the father of the household. That is a sovereign governing sphere in and of itself. And that's really where most governance should come from. It only gets kicked to municipal government or county government, state government, Fed government, with fewer and fewer legislative fields to be occupied as you move outward. By the time you get to the end, there's almost nothing for the Fed if it's not in the generic competency of that like orb of power or whatever. So it's very important that when we talk about these, I guess, four popes, Pius IX, Leo the 13th, Pius the 10th, and Pius the 11th, I have something special to say about each of them. They are the four generations of popes, four pontificates that categorically refused to deal with Garibaldi's in-placed government, Italian unification. And that I would imagine, I haven't looked enough into it, but I would imagine all of them, not just Pius IX, shared a kind of commissary with Jefferson Davis. But as a matter of fact, Pius IX sent him a very loving consolation letter, a crown of thorns he allegedly wove for him. You can go see that in New Orleans. And they became great friends. And the Confederacy in the American South, where both you and I are at, Jay, I'm an adoptive Southerner because I love it so much. The center was New Orleans. And of course, I go to the TLM in New Orleans. And the Bishop Lynch, it's a storied history there. The Confederacy was very Catholic friendly because it was borrowing from this idea out of the Catholic intellectual tradition of subsidiarity.
Yeah, I have heard a little bit about this. I would contribute more so in terms of my knowledge when it comes to the issue of Garibaldi, because he was a follower of Giuseppe Mazzini, and of course Giuseppe Mazzini was probably the equivalent to Albert Pike in Europe. I mean, the Albert Pike, being the Confederate Freemasonic philosopher, writing Morals and Dogma, the Bible of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, and Mazzini kind of functions in this way for Europe. And there's a lot of famous letters between Mazzini and people, and Mazzini seems to be also in some degree a successor to the ideals of the French Revolution's Jacobins and true Illuminism. So when we're talking about the actual Illuminati, there's a great book by my publisher that's actually a really scholarly treatise called Perfectibilists. It's the history of the Bavarian Illuminati, and you can kind of trace the ideological lineage, at least, perhaps even Masonic Lodge lineage, to from the time of the French Revolutionaries, the Jacobins, up through to Mazzini. And so you had these movements in Italy, like Young Italy, and they were really pushing for what at that time was like a radical leftism, which a lot of people don't know that it was nationalist. And so Garibaldi, not only was he famous because he was working towards this notion of Italian unification and kind of a revolutionary nationalism, he was also in many ways kind of one of the fathers of the modern mafia. So the Sicilian mafia actually comes out of a lot of the people that were recruited and fought with Garibaldi. I'm not saying that everybody in the mafia is a Freemason or revolutionary per se, but there was an overlap because a lot of the mafiosi were they were kind of like libertarian militia freedom fighters to a degree before they turned into kind of being kind of a protection racket, organized crime thing. So it's a really fascinating history. The Selwyn Robb book on this is really good for those that are wondering where I'm getting this. But he has his whole first chapter is about this. He doesn't go into Garibaldi, but this also is why there's a connection between there's a ambiguous relationship between organized crime and the papacy as well. So you kind of get at times alliances, at times kind of a falling out, depending, I guess, upon which pope it is and what his policies are in terms of the mafia. But it's also interesting that Garibaldi was part of one of these, I guess I'd say quasi-revolutionary, well, not quasi-illuminist groups called the Carbonari, and they were an occult revolutionary secret society that was also pushing a lot of this revolutionary Masonic stuff. Actually,
I didn't know Garibaldi was Carbonari. Is that
he
really?
Yeah, he was inducted at one point. I think that's right. He joined them. There's a great article I'll send you, just written by some like normie historian dude, but he wrote a thing on the history of Italian unification and Garibaldi and Masonry. But anyway, I won't keep going on that all day. But so
this is the Carbonari actually, just yes or no, you don't want to stay here. The Carbonari actually high-ranking Masons, or are they fully separate? You hear both stories. I hear both stories.
I'm not sure because it's like, and a lot of these kind of split off in more obscure groups. Like what does it exactly mean to be like regularized? You know what I mean? Like, for example, Crowley's Masonry, they'll call it Black Masonry and Black Lodges because supposedly they're not officially recognized, but then people will go from, high-level Masonry and then go and study the Crowley stuff. So I don't really know exactly what that even means, but I don't know. Good question. I did read a long time ago where I got into this first was there's a Catholic guy, I'm pretty sure he's Catholic. His name's Charles Heckathorn. He has a 2-volume thing on the history of secret societies, and it's a really good book. And I think he covers the Carbonari pretty well in there. But anyway, I'll pass it over to you because this is the setting, right? This is the background of what's going on in the life of Pius IX, correct?
Yes, sir. Yeah, definitely. I mean, like it's all the same time period. Literally, Italian unification begins 1861, which is a red letter date for us Americans too. It's, if you don't know the start, you people out there, if you don't know the start of the American Civil War, and the likenesses are remarkable between the, again, I defer to what you, Jay, said so much about the differences in like ethno-nationalism, where you have subsidiarity built in. It's like why are all of our political terms centering around the polis, the city? It's because Dasein, to use a German term, being there, is a natural law principle. Like a referee in a basketball game can't make the call as to whether or not the player's foot was an inch from out of bounds or out of bounds, unless he's the ref in the position to make the call. If I want to take my wife out on a date, we have to get a babysitter. It doesn't do enough. We have to have someone that's Dasein actually there in person, right? I can't just call my, like, 8-year-olds even once every 5 minutes. Not only would that ruin the day, but you have to have someone that's there. As a matter of fact, you have to have, as George W. Bush always said, boots on the ground, right? To maintain a real governing presence if you want to run a police state or something like that. So the point is, governance requires being there. Everyone acknowledges it in all of these other common sense fora. But all of a sudden, because of post-French Revolution notions of what's called virtual representation, we think that we can have any of the three good regimes, monarchy, aristocracy, republic, that's like hemispheric. I mean, that's the notion. That's really what James Madison is packaging in famous Federalist 10. And I'm having this Straussian on my show tomorrow. He's a big name, and as a pro-lifer, I salute him, Dr. Hadley Arkes. I'll
Neil
be doing
Strauss?
kind of, yeah. What's that?
Neil Strauss? I'm just joking.
No,
A big name Strauss. He's the guy that wrote the game, the pickup arts. I'm just joking.
Yeah, they're all obsessed with that song. No, like Leo Strauss, who has this idea of really, really big or right-wing government, which is kind of popular right now, which I think is I'm very allergic to. It's very, very dangerous thing, like at these, sort of an aside, but at these Straussian right-wing university institutions like Claremont, McKenna, or Hillsdale College, you see that on sometimes even Fox News, or University of Dallas, even though that's a Catholic university. There's some of them that people know of. They're like, we take pride. We have our students read the Federalist Papers. It's like, well, are you having your students read the Federalist Papers in conjunction with their dialogic dance partner, the Anti-Federalist Papers? Because Federalist 10, where James Madison attempts to controvert 2,500 years of political theory that a republic requires, if you want small government, it requires small economic land mass, geographic land mass. He's trying to controvert Aristotle, Plato, Seneca, Cicero, Augustine, all of the Salamancans, Aquinas, Bellarmine, Suarez. James Madison is just inverting that in Federalist number 10. So if people remember that vaguely from reading it in high school or maybe a poli-sci program undergrad, James Madison, whether you know it or not, is in dialogue with anti-Federalist pseudonymous writers who are also writing into the New York Gazette. One of them is Brutus. Another one is Cato. And it's like Brutus's 4th and 6th letters. He's obliterating the argument you see before you in famous Federalist 10. Cato's 3rd letter obliterates that argument and just adverts to the 2,500-year-old Republican theory. Like, you want small government, you have to have small geographic landmass. The notion of nearly a hemisphere-sized republic, like what America currently is, that's a contradiction in terms. That's a circular square. So it's really, really important that this is the kind of just, I want to get to what you were talking about, Marx and Lincoln, who are great admirers of each other. I'll do the J. Dyer and flash. This is what I was going all day. This is a really good book. People should read it. It justifies what you're talking about 100-fold, Jay. Lincoln was really a hell of a rhetorician and played upon founding principles that were completely anti-subsidiarity, even though the American founding was all about subsidiarity, local governance. And Lincoln was all about subverting local governance. And this is what the Confederates were saying till the cows came home.
Yeah, a lot of people find this crazy, but I did find it. I don't know if it's still there, but one day, just randomly, I was playing around on the Lincoln archives, and I found some documents talking about his interest in Rosicrucianism. So I don't know how long he had that interest, or if he was, interested to the point of being inducted into it, or dabbling, or what. But I always thought that was interesting that he did have at least some phase of occultism, and I think people say that his wife was into weird seances or something like that. I don't know how true that is, but I want to remind you guys in the chat too, if you want to ask questions, use the super chat function. Remember, we do have to abide by obviously the community guidelines, so don't ask me crazy questions. And you can also ask Tim questions as well. And Tim's channel, as you guys know, is Rules for Retrogrades. He is linked in the show description. So getting to this issue of, I think a lot of people think of Lincoln as a freedom fighter and, this kind of stuff. And why would we see then this sort of alliance and this appreciation with Karl Marx? Well, for those that don't know, remember, Karl Marx isn't really a liberation freedom fighter. A lot of what he's selling is packaged in this idea of the eventual libertarian freedom of the individual, because original Marxism has as its final phase libertarianism, the withering away of the state. And so, but that's not really what Marxism is about, in my view. In my view, it's kind of a morphing, changing thing that can fit wherever it needs to be, depending upon the time. And that's why Marxism shifts away from classical Marxism and into these variants and offshoots like Soviet bloc Marxism, like the Frankfurt School, and like Fabian socialism. Those are all kind of offshoots. Sometimes Fabianism is called reform Marxism. And those allow it to operate in this long march through the institutions, the way Antonio Gramsci talked, who's another one of these Italian famous Marxist revolutionaries. And if I recall, Gramsci was a Mason too, but most of these guys who are really into this tend to have been at some point Masons. But it's not really about freedom and liberation is the point. It's more so about different means and methods of control is my view of it. And I've always viewed Marxism as a tool for big capital. It's basically a wrecking ball to collectivize and transfer wealth offshore, and it creates new markets, according to Professor Anthony Sutton. When it does its job of kind of wrecking things, it creates new markets. And we can begin to say, oh, maybe that might be part of the reason for the function of Lincoln, right? And setting aside the moral issues of, what everybody talks about in regards to the Civil War, with Lincoln, you have a clear change in the attitude towards states' rights, and it's very much a top-down approach, which is what ends up winning out. And I've heard a lot of good historical analyses that point out that this really fits with the agenda of a lot of northern industrialists. So a lot of the really wealthy families in the North that want cheap labor in the factories, that's a big motivator for what's going on in this time period that people don't know about. But to get back to your point, what do you want to tell us about this attitude towards, because this is very important for the Roman Catholic Church in Europe at this time, because why do we have these guys so mad? Why are these socialist and quasi-socialist revolutionaries and nationalists even, why are they so mad at the idea of the Vatican, and why do we have these posts basically locked in the Vatican at one point? What's the big deal with this?
Well, I would say that the motivation behind rolling up the Vatican, which was a international sovereignty that was much larger, dating back to 1,000 years beforehand, much larger than just the city state that it eventually became. Even though these four popes, Pius IX, 10, 11, and Leo the 13th, refused for the first 72 years to accept even being a city state. that they were not only an otherworldly sovereignty for Roman Catholics, but were an actual this worldly city state that had holdings that were extensive beyond just whatever it is, 100 and
Do you think this was like the revolutionaries just like wanted the loot, or was it more than that? Like they saw this as, you know, a domain that they couldn't control, that they wanted to shut down. I mean, all the above. What do you see it as a primary motivator for them?
Well, as the those who were Masons wanted to do whatever they could to debilitate the Roman Catholic Church. This is that time period when you get more papal encyclicals on Freemasonry than anything else, than any other topic. It's because it was so beefed up in this time period. These guys from really Pius VIII had a Secretary of State that was the one that we think actually intercepted. I had a book coming out on this, but it's been slowed. He's the one, Pius VIII Secretary of State, might have been the one to actually intercept what's now become known as the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita. People ascribe it to later in the 19th century. We think it was earlier, like second decade of the 19th century, that they actually intercepted it. And there are all kinds of famous characters associated with that. But so there's that. But set that aside for a second. The fact that the Freemasons and the Roman Catholic Church don't like each other. They're diametrical opposites. We can't ignore this connection, the other couplet that was happening in the Western Hemisphere of national sovereignties growing bigger, growing more global, growing more hemispheric, which is all think about it as a distinction of degree. I literally just think about it arithmetically. Globalism, which is a proposition that comes from the Bible, it's on the ascent when the notion of a republic being a city-sized grows into something the size of an average northeasterly American state. You have a shifting scope of what you expect from virtual representation. And if that shifts to 50 state, 2/3 of the population of the Western Hemisphere, which is what the United States is, if that can be a republic, when a republic was supposed to be a little city state, that's what we get from Greece and ancient Rome, then this is not only the long march of subversion through the institutions, it's the long march of globalism toward what we recognize as globalism simpliciter in the 21st century, when you can have a global bug that helps in some sort of grand reset. I'm trying to codify a little bit here.
The money power behind something like the Marxist International, right? Marxism is an internationalist movement, and if you see Old Abe as a representation of the industrial power, which is how I see them, and they're two forces of an internationalism in a way, because megacorp, right? Fortune 100, they are also of their own very nature international, just as much as the socialist internationals. And this is one reason why the Fabians are really pro big capital, is that they pointed out that the same internationalism underlies both Marxism and monopoly capitalism. They're inherently international. So we can begin to see why really maybe what we have is competing internationalisms, right? From the vantage point of the Roman Catholic Church, it sees itself as kind of the divinely appointed international institution. And you get these competing internationalist institutions that overlap, like Freemasonry as an international naturalist organization, as Leo XIII calls it in his anti-Masonic encyclical Humanum Janus. You get an internationalism of capital and an internationalism of Marxism, and those three very closely overlap. I wasn't flipping you off. I'm doing all three together. Those three overlap, right? So this is not flip off. Those three overlap because they're all they have the same drive and power and force behind them for the most part. They might have some disagreements here and there, but they're all internationalist forces competing with the notion of various forms, perhaps, of Christian internationalism. But from the Roman Catholic vantage point, I'm assuming that's what you would say as well, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's all 100% stuff I would agree with. Jay, do you know about the? I just want to pause. Do you know about the? I didn't know about it till recently. The Hampton Roads Peace Conference, which occurred in February of 1865, between Lincoln, Seward, Secretary of State Seward, and the Vice President of the Confederacy. Have you ever heard of this?
I haven't. I've only read, I think, Dabney's book on Virginia, so I'm not super knowledgeable on the Civil War. But go ahead and tell us about it.
It's just, I know you want to steer clear of the ostensible fake, the ostensible motive for the Civil War. So I won't even name that S word, but it's wise to do so. But the Hampton Roads Peace Conference is important, February 1865, because it brings into question most of the mythology promoted by the normies on the animating forces of the Civil War. It states that Lincoln in the North, according to this mythology of Lincoln in the North, fought for the purpose of abolishing stuff, and the South fought for the purpose of protecting that same stuff. Actually, the Hampton Roads Peace Conference absolutely, definitively proves this is wrong, because you have a moment in time when the heads of state meet, and literally they're saying things like, either side's like, look, the Confederacy exists because we need to protect the sovereign right of secession. The American South was the fourth biggest economy in the world when you roll those states together. The North was impoverished. The South paid 70% of the tariffs, and the northern mercantilist interest was enriched by the way that the tariffs shook out in America. The South was generally free trade, I'd say, in a healthy way. And the South just said, look, Virginia, the most important state of the South, most important American state, entered into the Union in 1788 by naming for itself a right of secession. And they said, this is what's most important to us. That's what the Civil War is over. And Lincoln says several times over and over again, really a reiteration of what the Emancipation Proclamation was, which was an emancipation of 0 souls from that heinous institution, beginning with an S, because it did not free those who suffered under that institution in the North. It only claimed to free those in the South, and really, as countless others have noted before, all he was trying to do is foment revolution in the South by saying to Southern people under that yoke, go ahead and rebel against your owners. It'll only help us out in the North. But all of those people who suffered under that yoke in the North remain utterly free. It's just an odd twist if you read about this particular wartime meeting between heads of state under sovereign international immunity principles, because you have Lincoln saying, well, so what do you guys want? You want to come back into the Union and protect that institution that everyone says we're fighting over? And they're like, no, we don't want to come back in at all. That there are several. One, we don't like the tariff system, and number two, we're supposed to be able to secede, and our most important state is Virginia, and you're denying this. And Lincoln, as he'd repeated several times from 1855 to 1865, said, all I want to do is protect against the spread of that institution into the territories. But you Southern states, as he'd said several times in those 10 years, you can keep this institution. It's proven by what he says there at the Hampton Roads Peace Conference. It's really, I'm saying this not in a cynical way. I'm saying it in a way where I'd endorse the term. It is the proof text for why it's not just like lost causers who say this thing about the American South, that it really is about states' rights and localism and, what an old Catholic like me would say, subsidiarity. It has nothing to do with that S term. And de Tocqueville, who, by the way, offered to broker a deal between Lincoln and Jeff Davis, and Lincoln was the one that said no, not interested. He said that the condition in which American staves, those who rhyme with staves, they have the worst living conditions in the whole of the United States. In New Jersey, northern ones. So the ones in the South are not nearly so bad off as the ones in the North. This is captured a bit in Gangs of New York, where literally the federal forces turned the musket on Northern blacks and those who were dodging the draft, because Lincoln was so unpopular in the North as well. They had riots and blacks in the North that were literally getting slaughtered because of all these complicating factors. So I'm jumbling a lot together here, but I think it's important that people know that is a mythology that you've been handed on. There's one cause for the War of Northern Aggression, as it's often called, and it is secession / tariffs. It has nothing to do with what you've been told.
Now, you mentioned in your list of popes there during this time frame, as you got up into, you mentioned the Bays ones, and you said Pius, all the way up to 11. And I'm
Yes.
curious that you skipped Benedict the 15th. Is that because I read J.N.D. Kelly's History of the Popes? I know he's Oxford Anglican historian, but he made an interesting note that that Benedict the 15th seemed to be soft on modernism and was in some way either outright a supporter or cajoled into supporting the League of Nations, which was the Fabian institution at that time. As a result, that was attempted by the Rhodes Milner Roundtable groups to set up the proto-world government at that time, which was a socialist world government at that time. Is that what? Did you know about that? It's not a trick question. I'm just curious. Like, was that like what, or do you think Benedict the 15th was just kind of an not that important figure, or why is he not in the Bayes list?
Like all those things at once. I think I'd heard that a long time ago, but I honestly forgot that he falls in that chronological time period. But that all checks out with me, and he's often forgotten about just because I include him in my list of good 20th century popes who spoke out against feminism. But people often just forget him, to be honest. But I had heard that he's weak on several things it was important to be strong on. And multinationalism was way up there. I mean, I'll just get it out now. So Pius IX adds this close kinship with Jefferson Davis. It was really, really, he was the one that coined the term prisoner of the Vatican. He literally never even set foot into Rome, not even to go to the Trevi Fountain or whatever, or the Colosseum. So he was really big on what would later come to be called subsidiarity. And he knew that the institution over which people think that the Civil War in America was fought, he knows that that's wrong, but he saw way past. He didn't miss any tricks. He understood that Jefferson Davis and the American Confederates were really the rightful defenders of what would come to be called subsidiarity, even though it wasn't called that until Pius XI. Pius X, of course, is the one that condemned all of modernism, and he condemned liberal nationalism as one of those modernisms. And again, you intoned it really well, Jay.
And this by the way, for the audience, if you're interested, the book that covers this from the Catholic perspective is really just a collection of papal documents. It's the 16 papal documents from Tan Press, that covers this period in terms of the papal attitude that were the texts that were being written by these very popes.
Yep.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, then Leo the 13th actually, a lot of people don't know this. I know this well. For Thomas Aquinas, this is very important. The property right as a natural right, technically you can only say life and liberty are natural rights for Aquinas. He says individual private property rights are a corollary, a necessary corollary, entailed. They're one of the logical entailments of life and liberty. It requires private property to be carried on. So in every case, you need it. So it's basically a natural right. It is the Leo the 13th, the Thomistic Leonine Pope, that says this is such a strong connection in Thomas that I'm just going to bump it into the list of life, liberty, and property. So he's actually the one that does that in two of his encyclicals. He says, even though I'm the Thomistic Pope, I'm going to go ahead and bump up property in. And this is why property is really important, even to the Vatican. This is why we have land holdings, though the Masons don't think we should. So that's Leo the 13th, probably my favorite of all the popes. And then, of course, Pius the 11th is the one who actually, adverting back 40 years to one of those papal encyclicals by Leo the 13th, literally called 40th year, 40 years ago, Quadragesimo Animo, he uses the term subsidiarity for the first time ever. And now it's like a term that you can go find in Webster's dictionary. He made it up, subsidiarietà in Latin and Italian. So it actually means local government is natural and good, and that it's a grave evil to govern from afar.
Would that explain, in your view, and it's not a trick question, I'm not trying to trap you, I read all the encyclicals of Leo XIII, the Light of the Heavens book that Tan puts out. There may be more that are not in that book, but I read that book, which is 500 pages or whatever. But doesn't he has an encyclical, if I recall, it's been probably 15 years since I read it, but doesn't he have one on Christian democracy? Would that be fit into what you're talking about with this idea of localization from his perspective?
From Leo's?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he has I think he has an encyclical on Christian democracy.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I have to tell a lot of the trad cats is that, like, Aquinas actually advocated most practically in a way that Leo would be really proud of as a Catholic, and advert to time and time again. He says, look, because there are these three good regimes, and monarchy is actually the best but the hardest to do right. Aristocracy is the second best, second hardest to do right. Polity, republic, is the third best of the three good ones, but it's the easiest to do right. I advocate for Thomas Aquinas. I advocate for a mixed regime with a mixture of the three kinds of powers, and I think he locates in them one of the Psalms that says, look, there are these three basic powers in governance. There are basically the monarchical power, there is the aristocratic judging power, and there is the power of the many, the legislative. The lawmaking body is the people. Does this sound familiar? Yes. Leo the 13th actually, on this Thomistic basis, says, well, Thomas says the mixed regime is a fourth type that mixes monarchies, aristocracies, and republics. And that's what Thomas says will work most of the time, and you'll get the good parts of monarchy, aristocracy, republic. Right. And Leo says that's what is special about the American system of three-branch rule. Leo gives a little nod to Montesquieu here, three-branch government. And I think one of them, Thomas or Leo, I haven't looked at it in years, but Thomas or Leo actually quote that psalm, saying there are those three basic types of government. There's the executive power, right? Wielding the police power. Yeah. There's it's lawmaking, law enforcement, and law interpretation. That's basic. That's a natural law principle. Those are the three branches of government, and it's Thomistic mixed regime. It's deep stuff, and it's the best way to preserve what Pius XI will call subsidiarity, which you get with monarchy, which you get with aristocracy. It's not only for republics. Subsidiarity is for all good governance.
Now, in the Leo's encyclicals, I looked it up. The one I was thinking of is that's on democracy. Is called Gravis de Communi Re. I don't know Latin, so I'm not trying to butcher the Latin. And he says, "Oh, by the way, this is based on what we were saying in Rerum Novarum, which is famous because that's where he talks about the rights of capital versus the rights of labor, and not exploiting the workers, and this kind of stuff, but also not being straight up communist." I'm curious too because if I remember, Leo doesn't he have some pretty significant critiques of Americanism? Again, it's not a trick question because I'm just remembering. I haven't read this stuff in probably 15 years, but he has a pretty strong critique of Americanism too, right? So,
absolutely.
So how do we get from what you're saying, and I'm not calling you out, I'm just saying, you're saying, okay, he's giving a nod to American Republic. Is there a different idea of what Americanism that is like a betrayal of the original idea of America is that what you would say?
Yeah, I give a talk on this. So it's important that we go here. Yeah, Leo says this important thing. Some of my fellow trad cats get mad at me when I give this talk. I used to have the actual paragraph of speech memorized, but he says, America, in your youth, you did so much for the sublime causes of, he lists a couple desiderata, good things. But he also says, also, you did so much good for the cause of religion, knowing that it was mostly a bunch of Protestants that peopled America. Now, why did the United States of America do so much for the cause of religion? And what was this newfound burgeoning late 19th, early 20th century Americanism that he frowned upon? Well, specifically, it was the separation of church and state. The Masons in America said that their goal, they said this in the late 1800s, for the 1900s, would be the separation of church and state. And here's the thing on that one. 8 of the 13 original states in the United States under the First Amendment had religious establishments. Now there were establishments in Congregationalism in the North and Episcopalianism in the South, but 8 of the 13th. The First Amendment, drafted by Jefferson and Madison together, even though Jefferson was maybe a Mason, it flew directly in the face of what the Masons wanted 100 years earlier. The Masons had wanted separation of church and state, but that's exactly what they didn't get. America was enshrined as Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion from 1791, Jay, when that amendment, the first 8 amendments were passed, 3 years after the June of 1788, when the 8th and 9th and 10th states ratified the Constitution. 3 years later, the Anti-Federalists got their promised Bill of Rights, and that Bill of Rights contained the First Amendment. The Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Do you know what that stood for? Until 1947. 1947 being when all this stuff was changing around post-war, the Masons really took control in this country. It stood for the proposition that all 13 states, capital S states, had their own religion. Their own religion would be codified. There couldn't be a national religion that the Congress sets, but that the state legislatures of all 13 states.
The states can do that, yeah.
They could do that, and they should, and they did. And guess what? It's only under, tie it to Lincoln, the 14th Amendment, that in a case called Everson versus Board of Education in 1947, that the SCOTUS in the United States, which had 7 of 9 Freemasons, that number would rise to 8 of 9 in the 1950s.
You just got refuted. You just got refuted because John Duns Scotus is from the Middle Ages. Boom.
That's right. Boom. Dig it. Deal with it.
All right, that was a dumb joke. You mean the Supreme Court. I know what you mean. Go ahead.
Yeah. So 7 of the 9 Supreme Court justices were Masons, and they finally got done the goal for the 20th century, which was to codify separation of church and state, even though it was guaranteed in the First Amendment that church and state would never be separated in America, and that each state legislature could decide an official sect of Christianity for that state. Well, they interpreted the First Amendment for the first time ever in this Everson versus Board of Education case to mean that now it was illegal for Congress and the state legislatures, not just Congress, to disestablish the official state religion of the state legislature. So they fully reversed the meaning of the First Amendment. And
This is
that's,
this is where we
yeah.
get the longest word, right? Disestablishmentarianism, supposedly not like the longest word.
A longer word than disestablishmentarianism is disestablishment. Oh, yeah, you can always throw an ad, but I always say disestablishmentarianists because you've got the extra.
Anti-disestablishmentarianists. Okay,
Yeah.
but if I remember too, I think Paul Fisher in his which is a Tan Tradcat book, in his book on the lodge, he has a chapter on the Supreme Court about and how many of them became Masons. There's a section talking about what you're talking about. I just remember that. But yeah, my mind thinks in terms of footnotes when you talk about these things. I think, oh yeah, there's a book over here that talks about that.
Impressive.
Do you know the book I'm talking about, the Paul Fisher book?
Yeah, I do. I know what the cover looks like.
I think he has there's a chapter in there on Supreme Court judges and them being co-opted as Freemasons, and that's part of the way that we got to where we are. And so you're saying that so the Masons realized they would have to go into full on like state level attack vector, right, to get that through. Beyond,
yes, but
yeah,
normies don't know that. I mean, normies will throw like America was founded in 1791. They have the First Amendment. They think this means no integralism. It actually means no federal integralism, but a guarantee that states can integrate an official Christian sect. Actually, this is one of the most important books in my formation, like ever. It's by this law professor from Northwestern called Separation of Church and State. Everyone needs to read this. It is a total eye-opener. It's sort of like the last word on the topic. This guy, Philip Hamburger. In law school, I was clerking for Mike Rappaport of the Originalism Center, and I was like, oh, he gave me this book, and he was like, Tim, I know your interest. You need to read this by Philip Hamburger. And I was like, oh, wasn't Philip Hamburger the guy that wrote the biography on Felix Frankfurter? And he didn't get it. It was a bad dad joke. But
well, I think of Neil Hamburger, the comedian. So, but there was something I was going to bring up in all this. Oh, okay. So this is interesting stuff. I didn't know any of these cases. The only reason I know about all this stuff, or some of this stuff, not a lot of this stuff, is not necessarily Tradcat days. But I used to have a Protestant pastor who was super into American history and constitutionalism, and he was big into reading the Federalist Papers, anti-federal. I mean, he like had this giant American history. Basically, for him as a Protestant, the history of America is church history. You know what I mean? Like that is the history of the church for him. So he was really devoted to it. But he had made a lot of these points that you're making, and he was Presbyterian, so he didn't want necessarily a. I don't think he believed in a established state, states like small states. But he was kind of a Reconstructionist, so he thought that there should be like theonomy and biblical principles in state government. Anyway, that doesn't matter. How do we get though from? So, do you view this is one thing I'm curious about this principle of subsidiarity and the ideas in rerum novarum? What do you say to this argument? And I don't have any take on this either way, so I'm not trying to argue some position. But what do you say to people that say, well, Pacem in Terris of John the 23rd, which argues for international economic organizations and kind of like a World Bank almost, or who knows exactly what he means. It's people thought of it. They called him the Pink Pope because of this kind of stuff. Do you see Pacem in Terris as a natural outworking of the principles of rerum novarum and this stuff, or is that something that's going off kilter?
No, it's I think going way off kilter. I mean, from let's say John the 23rd, Paul the 6th, all of these post-conciliar popes start going way off kilter. And forget Francis for now, because he goes way, way, way off kilter. But it all the way through JP2 and Benedict 16. These are the post-World War II popes who see, I mean, I don't know. With our mutual bud, Frank, quite frankly, we did a group reading the way you guys do some from time to time of Windswept House. Have you ever read that, Jay?
I've read most of his other books. I have not read that one.
It's very interesting. I mean, like JP2 was anti-communist, blah, blah. You're supposed to call him John Paul the Great because of some of that stuff. But then he also was very friendly to League of Nations type of thinking, UN type stuff.
Right.
And I would say that everyone in the reconfigurement of Vatican relations with the people of Israel after World War II, I'd say everyone in the Vatican that wants to reconfigure their relations with the Protestants, which were happening about the same time. Everyone that wants to reconfigure relations with the Orthodox, though again, that's not nearly so wide a chasm and so not nearly so problematic. They were the ones that were tended to be the globalists, really starting at the end of World War II. Like, when did this stuff happen in America, that the Freemasons on the court fully undid church and state, stood it on its head? 1947. How much stuff happened in 47, 48, or 49 right after the close of World War II? It's sometimes it makes my head spin how many of my
Well, by the way, this what you're talking about, Supreme Court in this time period, this would have to be, by the way, what was in place before Roe versus Wade, right?
Yes, and this is so what I'm going to be arguing with Dr. Hadley Arkes tomorrow, who's a friend. He's a fellow Catholic, I think, but he wrote like the Born Alive legislation for 2008. He's kind of a big wig. He's a heavy hitter in the old school pro-life movement, so that's all good. Of course, blah blah blah. But he's, he basically is like all the other West Coast Straussians. I don't know if you know the difference between a West Coast Straussian, a Midwest Straussian, and an East Coast Straussian. But you could basically tell the difference between the three of them by the propositions: America is ancient or modern, fill in the blank. America is good or modernity or antiquity is good or bad. And then conclusion, therefore, America is bad. So the West Coast Straussians like Harry Jaffa or Hadley Arkes is sometimes thrown in there. It stands for the proposition that America is ancient in its, provenance of ideological ideas. America is ancient, antiquity is good, therefore America is good. That's most of the West Coast Straussians who hang out at Claremont. The Midwest Straussians, who some of them hang out at places like Notre Dame, like Michael Zuckert. The rest of them hang out at Hillsdale College. They stand for the proposition America is modern, post. Strauss made Machiavelli and everything that happened after Machiavelli, the dividing line between antiquity and modernity. It's weird. Machiavelli is not that important. America's modern, modernity is good. Say the Midwestern Straussians, therefore America is good. Then you get the East Coast Straussians like Alan Bloom, who say America is modern, but modernity is bad, therefore America is bad. If you use that little formula, you can figure out any of the Straussians. And the Straussians are by and large the only American academics who are a kind of conservative, but they're all very wonky. So I'll be arguing this to Hadley Arkes tomorrow, who the West Coast Straussians love, they think America is ancient. They love Lincoln, though they don't like Jefferson, which I think is really weird. So they configure like Lincoln in a toga is basically America at its highest. They love Lincoln. They don't think he's a Marxist at all, or maybe they just like that. And the 14th Amendment, which is really the new Constitution, its jurisprudence not only enabled Everson versus Board of Ed, that case which stood separation of church and state on its head and made it a thing in 1947. It was the governing jurisprudence. Then you had, of course, the 1965 case, Griswold versus Connecticut, which made it illegal for states to illegalize contraception. So that's bad. They made a ban on bans in 65. 4 years later, in 1969, under 14th Amendment jurisprudence, there's a case called Stanley versus Georgia. They put a federal ban on states that banned pornography. So they made it illegal to make pornography illegal for states. 4 years after that, in 1973, using 14th Amendment jurisprudence, they banned states banning abortion, as everyone knows. Then, like 30 years later, Lawrence versus Texas. Notice that the state is always the defendant in these cases. They use 14th Amendment jurisprudence in Lawrence versus Texas to say that Skittles, sod was states couldn't ban Skittles /SOD. And then 10 years after that, same 14th Amendment jurisprudence. Basically, all this goes right back to Lincoln. It's illegal for states to ban gay marriage. So,
are you saying that you're having to argue this for something relating to law? Is that what you're saying? Like for one of your projects or something?
Well, I'm just kind of connecting the dots here. I'm saying the folks that are the Catholics. Let me say that. Catholics who are on our side in the culture wars and aren't left Caths or anything, but liked Lincoln, that liked big government, that liked these Straussian ideas, that I say tend toward globalism, right? Tend toward nationalism over localism. I always ask them, well, if you like Lincolnianism and hemispheric big government, big right-wing government, which is what Lincoln stood for, then how come the greatest work product of Lincolnianism, which is the 14th Amendment, which said subsidiarity doesn't work? That's what the Civil War was allegedly a proposition for, even in the normies mythology, right? That dreaded institution, we're not naming it here. That is what most people think the Civil War was fought over. And they said, yeah, subsidiarity failed. I mean, if you go ask these are all Catholic professors, by the way, who are calling themselves post-liberals, Gladden Papin or Sohrab Ahmari or Patrick Deneen or someone like Hadley Arkes. They say you need big government, you need Lincolnianism, so that right-wing Catholic people or Christians, simpliciter, can rule with an iron fist. And I say that just doesn't work. How come the 14th Amendment was only ever used to make it illegal for localities to illegalize vices, the way it was legal for them to ban in original America? I'm just saying original America stood for subsidiarity. Post-Lincolnian America stood for Masonic nationalism creeping toward globalism.
So, and for the people in the audience that are curious, because somebody was asking me this yesterday, there's a great book that's it's public domain now because it was written like 100 years ago, over 100, 123, 5. So what's the Orthodox view? Well, I think between Orthodox and Catholic, the basic principle of confessional states is something that we affirm. So you can read Konstantin Pabianatsev's book, Reflections of a Russian Statesman, which is basically making the same argument that to have the removal of religion and the church from the public sphere actually doesn't get you freedom. It doesn't get what the Masonic promise is. You just get the state as the new religion. That's the argument of that book. And, Leo that says similar things to Pius X when they talk about combating the liberalism of the time, the modernism. They point out that this leads to, tyranny, to lead to statism if you try to no longer have confessional states, basically, is the point here. Right. So one thing that occurs, though, is that, and this is not about Vatican II, the Jesuits per se, but I'm curious about your view on John Courtney Murray and some of these guys at Vatican II that were prominent, not just Jesuits, but Thomists, because they were trying to kind of, Jacques Maritain, they were trying to utilize a lot of these Thomist arguments from these figures about what they consider to be natural law as the basis for why we should have total pluralism and basically no notion of confessionalism. And you really got to read this book from a traditional Catholic lawyer guy, John Courtney Murray. This book's right up your alley. You got to read it. The Time Life magazine book, because he argues in there that the American oligarchic money structure was really influential in getting a lot of the theologians at Vatican II on board with them to push Americanism at Vatican II. So, and I'm not trying to make this a debate about Vatican II. I'm just curious, like, what do you think about the idea in John the 23rd's encyclical Pacem in Terris and the Maritain ideas of pluralism and this kind of stuff. Like, to me, that seems integral to destroying any notion of integralism as a thing that would be part of the message of Roman Catholicism in the 20th century. What's your view on that?
Well, I mean, I think I agree with where you're inclining there. I mean, I'm not like a sedevacantist or anything like that, but the ideas,
Right.
the ideas of political economy at the Second Vatican Council were bad. Were bad, and
Let me
they're
rephrase the
not.
question, because I'm not trying to trap you on a trad question. What I'm asking, I guess, is like, the argument of a lot of the spirit of Vatican II is, hey, we're going to use the principles that we find in Rerum Novarum and in, they argue that it's a clean sort of outworking from Rerum Novarum to the On Christian Democracy to Maritain and John Courtney
Yeah.
Murray, and they can say, look, we've got this tradition in the Catholic Church of, is it Bellarmine has an, I think he has an essay on the possibility of, I can't remember the name of it. I have a little Bellarmine essay from a long time ago. But anyway, so he has something about like limited government. So they're trying to take the notion of limited government and say, no, see, that equals, basically pluralism, and the church has nothing to say on the state. The church has nothing to say on civic life and abortion, these kinds of things.
Yeah, no, that's so. John Courtney Murray's bad. We're both alumni of the Greg, where Vatican II had its shadow council. They would meet there with just the liberals at night, and he was the main American liberal
Right.
Vatican council father. And when the fellow trads want to slur me, they call me John Courtney Murray. I couldn't be really further from his thought, because the ideas of Bellarmine and the Salamancans and Thomas and Aristotle, all this whole political tradition, which is really pretty uniform. It goes in one direction and culminates with Bellarmine, a great little book. I was looking to see if it was on my desk, called the Political Philosophy of
That's it. That's it.
Bellarmine.
That's the book I'm trying to think of. Yeah.
Yeah, with John Rager by Father Rager, which is a dope name. Yeah, that's a good little book. I think I paid some exorbitant fee for it. It's hard to find now. It's like $40 and it's like that big. But that's a great book. And here's the principles. Small limited government is natural. That's what subsidiarity is. Subsidiarity is part of the natural law. Pius the 10th, 11th affirmed this. Literally, it is a grave evil to vie for a more distant government to occupy a legislating field, that a more local government has in its competency. This means limited government, okay? And that's there in Aquinas. Aquinas says not every virtue should be mandated, not every vice should be proscribed. He thought that in some states, given a certain kind of temperament, if it's common enough, prostitution should not necessarily be illegal. That wasn't because he was a liberal or because he was parsing or debating whether or not this is a grave evil. It was just because the natural law, as he says in question 91 or 92, of the Summa, in the treatise on law there, natural law is a subset of the eternal law. It's not going to be a perfect reduplication of it. So different polities are going to work out how much morality is being legislated as according to the need of that polity. That's not like pluralism, which is fake and gay. That's not, relativism or anything like that, which is fake and lame. It's just that the natural law principle is subsidiarity itself. Now, here's what John Courtney Murray et al. Don't get when they start talking about one of the other four, supposedly, this is a post-conciliar Catholic, post-Vatican II principle, solidarity. They often talk about this principle, Pacem in Terris, that you keep mentioning, Jay, and Paul VI, who came from this very Freemasonic family and had to, when he became Pope, announce that he was not a Skittles kind of person. Publicly, he announced that. He's talking not so much about subsidiarity anymore. The references to small government done locally, or else it's a grave evil, just vanish. And now all of a sudden they're talking about a second principle, solidarity. Solidarity makes sense as according to subsidiarity if you do it the right way. Solidarity says I, or says some preconciliar Catholic would just say, yeah, Montesquieu's 3 cardinal rules of republic. Keep them ideologically pure. You keep if you want a comic book club, make it only super fans, right? Super fans only. To do that, cardinal rule 1, you got to keep it small. You want to keep it pure ideologically, you got to keep it small. And then Montesquieu's 3rd rule is about separation of powers. It's not relevant here. But to keep it small, keep it pure. To keep it pure, keep it small by landmass. So what that means is there is a res publica, a public thing that Augustine talks about, Seneca, Cicero, Thomas Aquinas all talk about. A good republic should not have diversity. It should have no diversity. Basically, it should all be people that are like-minded. They should all occupy one city or maybe county if we want to expand it out geographically as far as it'll go. The people in your neighborhood should all be people that like the same stuff, ideally, if you want to have a res publica. And therefore, naturally, if you honor subsidiarity, there will be a natural outgrowth of this, which is something that you could call solidarity, right? If you keep it small and you keep it pure, then all the people in our little imaginary polis, right-wingers that want the same kind of stuff that we want, well, there will be a natural solidarity between this. But John the 23rd, Paul the 6th, John Courtney Murray, the Vatican Fathers, arguably JP2 and Benedict XVI, though they both have some development in their thought organically. All these post-conciliar guys say solidarity means something else. They ignore subsidiarity and they start talking about world community and fake and lame stuff like that.
So solidarity begins to mean basically just cloaked versions of global governance. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. Via the creeping notion of what the most important sentence of this pod is what you said at the beginning. Not nation like ethno-nationality from a hilltop shire in Scotland from William Wallace's day. That's a nation, right? It means you're related to all these people. Third cousins are marriable, but you're related to all of them. Not that. That's not what a nation is anymore. A nation now, for these creeping globalists of the latter half of the 20th century, in and out of the church, now all of a sudden a nation is like a hemisphere. Now all of a sudden a nation is this 50 state union instead of the real state, capital S, in America. Well, there are 13 of them, and they're like 13 countries.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, right, it would be like America's 50 or whatever, 51 nations, right? I mean,
yes, yeah.
Yes,
absolutely.
Basically, small sovereign states is the idea of balanced, the one and the many there, and Washington would have a very minimal role. Is the idea, right?
100%. I mean, that's what the Articles of Confederation were, Jay. All of these terms. Congress is a sovereign international immunity principle term, meaning sovereign countries that would get together only to fight wars together. FOTUS, from which we get our term federal, is a term. There's like, if you read Tolkien, there's this concept of the Entmoot, the meeting of the Ents. Moot is an old term for Congress in the Middle English. They're all sovereign international immunity terms, meaning you have 13 little countries that only share one branch of government, which is all the United States had from 1776 until 1788, when they illegally got rid of the Articles of Confederation and replaced it with the new Constitution. They didn't have 3-branch rule. They just had one Congress, once a year meeting, an Entmoot of the 13 little countries that would get together and decide, how do we raise money for the armies? It was called the requisition system. It wasn't a capitation tax system, which is still illegal under the original Constitution, even though Woodrow Wilson changed that. So it was one branch rule, and the countries, all the powers were really the 13 little states, which is why that term state means country. And guess what? Even under the Constitution, until post World War II, when the Freemasons on the Supreme Court really took over and changed everything. It wasn't that bad. The original Constitution, I'd say, was less subsidiarian than the Articles of Confederation, but it wasn't that bad. It was still good enough. They still recognized, like the 10th Amendment, there's something called the police power, which belonged only to state legislatures, never to the Congress. The police powers were the abilities to regulate health, safety, welfare, morals, and security. So you could regulate morality, but do it at the state level. That's operative principle of subsidiarity. And in Article 1 of the Constitution, which said what the Congress should do, in Article 1, Section 8, you have these 15 or 16 very unsexy, very amoral powers that are left to the federal legislature, the Congress. And they're all things that are very unsexy, boring, like coining money, building postal roads, that sort of thing. None of them are the police power, which the states or the people always hold, as per the police power of the 10th Amendment. And that's very Catholic.
Essentially, it's Lincoln then that is the pivotal shift to this new kind of thinking in terms of the history of America. And you're making a connection too with certain of these Maritain and maybe John Courtney Murray level theologians who kind of do the same thing with this on a global level of how the nation state is really not a localized group of people. The nation is now this like giant wannabe imperium. I don't know what we would call it. I mean, Brzezinski calls America an imperium, by the way. I forgot that in his last book, he actually calls it the American Empire. So it's like, that's not, people say, oh, when you use the word imperialism, you're using Marxist terminology. No, that's the terminology of the people that run the government. They call it the American Imperium. But it's this weird, postmodern imperium now. Where do you see this going in terms of we're basically going into the direction of like total tyranny, right?
Totally.
Legally speaking, like how law, I don't know anything about law. This is your field. Law in the modern world, is it just going into total like tyranny basically?
Yeah. I'm bad at predicting the future, but once subsidiarity is lost at any of the level of the regimes, you're going into total lawfare of tyranny and just weird, strange, unexpected sudden violent twists and turns. Who could have predicted what's happened over the last 8 years with the people that think you can morph your whether you're a boy
I can't imagine the weird situations that puts people in the legal world in what's the legal status of these now basically fantasy fiction level claims that people have?
It's strange. And the whole game after Lincoln, after the 14th Amendment, which gets called the new Constitution, because all the procedural due process that was really rigorous of the original Constitution was just like, does this fall in the federal legislative field? And the answer was almost always no. Everything fell to the state legislatures.
So you're basically saying you're saying Lincoln's a furry is basically what you're saying.
Lincoln, yeah. Well,
Lincoln's basically a furry. That sums it all up, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I have no problem with that, man. I mean, Lincoln is way, way worse than everybody thought. And Horace Greeley, who ran, did you know Marx had a semi-regular column in the New York, not the New York Gazette, the early New York Times, basically, New York Tribune. Horace Greeley, who was the editor, had Karl Marx writing very regularly. He and Lincoln were big admirers of each other. They each wanted big geographic landmass. They each wanted central control from above. They were each lifelong atheists. There's just so much overlap, and they really admired what one another was doing, and they were contemporaries, and they were each corresponding with New York Tribune or whatever it was. So it's very important to see the big tricks here. But I don't object, not that you thought I did, to any of those questions at all. The political economy envisioned by post-conciliar popes and thinkers, you keep mentioning who is the Frenchie you kept mentioning?
Frenchie.
They called himself a Thomist. He wasn't a real Thomist.
Oh, Jacques Maritain.
Maritain. He was like really close friends with Saul Alinsky. Did you know that?
No, but I did know that like he made it his mission basically to figure out a way to argue that, you know, Thomism and the Roman Catholic position basically are religious pluralism and no confessional states. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, it's just kind of wild, but like that, he made that his mission basically.
It's stupid. You can have confessional state. I mean, if you reason this back to, okay, first Christian millennium, it's not an issue, right? Because you're just a Christian, right? And is, you know, we don't have to argue whether that Christian religion was Catholic or Orthodox. There, it doesn't matter. It was Church East, Church West. There's no such imaginary Christian as non-sacramental, non-episcopal Christians, right? That wouldn't get developed until the 16th century. It was just Church West was Rome, Church East was Constantinople. There was some tension, but you know, both sides had something based to offer. You know, that's the first millennium. Then you have beginning of the second millennium, the Great Schism between Church East, Church West. They're both, you can call them the church, Benedict says, right? You guys have valid sacraments. You guys have, even from our perspective, valid bishops, blah, blah, blah. But now there's this canker on the heart, some split in the family. But that's not really so bad because it's already neatly divided and it's not that big of a division anyway. But then come the 16th century, you don't have a neat division between East and West. Now all of a sudden you have these like weirdos that think you can be a Christian without even sacraments or bishops or being part of the church. You can just be part of a book club, read the Bible, and without any sacraments, I guess, aside from baptism, you just be part of the crew. And that's really weird. And they were pockmarked all up throughout, particularly the northern part of Europe. And so it was a real dilemma that only in the second half of the second Christian millennium did the church start having to parse out religious difference, religious tolerance, religious pluralism. What do we make of it? It was absolutely not an issue for that first millennium. And the way they did it was like first Diet of Spire, second Diet of Spire. They're saying you are allowed to let your prince pick whether you're Lutheran or Catholic. Then the second one, they said you're not allowed to let your prince pick. And then eventually, I think it's, my history's bad, 1549 or no, 1555, the Peace of Augsburg, where they say basically cuius regio, cuius religio, which means like, okay, we're just going back to the first Diet of Spire. Yeah. Wherever
basically,
it is,
the church is just the state. Yeah.
Yeah. If you have a Lutheran ruler, then that little section, your little province, which is at least subsidiarian, will be Lutheran. If you have a Catholic ruler, that little section will be Catholic. That's not religious tolerance in the style that liberals like John Courtney Murray would later describe 400 years later.
Right.
It is saying that you're going to have essentially a uniform religious state that will all be one thing. It'll just follow the sovereign. But the important thing is that it's for a small region. The notion of pluralism is this stupid idea of a melting pot, the size of a hemisphere, right, where everyone can get along, even though, you know, you have Satanists,
totally
Muslims,
different values.
Christians. Yeah. I think an Orthodox and a Catholic can live in the same republic. I don't think a Catholic and a Satanist or even one of the non-monotheists, or maybe one of the other monotheists, I don't know if they can live in the same republic and call it a res publica. Anyway, that's
interesting. It's good points. I would say to people in the audience, remind you guys too that if you want to support the show, do so via the super chat functions. As you guys know, super chats are through Streamlabs, and that link is right there in the chat if you want to send a super chat. By the way, you guys, you can send a super chat at any time, and I will answer it as soon as I'm on the next stream. So if you watch this the next day or two and whatever, it's not live, I will still answer your question the next time. So you can do that. Also, if you want to follow Tim, if you would real quick, tell us what you talk about mainly on your channel. We have a lot of new people and a lot of people that may not be familiar with your stuff, even though we've done a few streams together. Tell us about your channel real quick, and then we'll go to the super chats. It was a really good discussion tonight, but I've kept you for an hour and a half. So what's the focus of Rules for Retrogrades, and what are you going to be covering in the next couple weeks?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I came to kind of light. I had already published a book, Catholic Republic, which is just about these principles tonight. You don't have to be Catholic. I think you would like the book, just about how these ideas aren't Protestant. They're from Leo and Thomas and stuff. And on that basis, Catholics got to know me on Taylor Marshall's channel, and we just ended up doing a bunch of shows on, go to the Latin Mass, don't go to the Novus Ordo. But we also did a bunch of shows on where did Francis come from, who was this group, this cabal of subversives called the St. Gallen Mafia that gave us the Francis pontificate. I still believe all that stuff. It's quite accurate, but it gets really negative. So once I split off from Marshall, I still do Pope shows, but the main four pillars of what I do on my channel to replace what do we do when we have a crisis in the pontificate is take things local. And it's not quite the Benedict option. It's patriarchy. That's prong number one. Every man should be the patriarch of his home. Wifely submission is a real thing. It's biblical. All Christians, even Protestants, can agree on it. Protestants, the based ones like Calvinists, do. If every man's the patriarch of his own home, you don't need big government. You have subsidiarity. That's the second prong. These two things go together. The third prong, I teach people how to homeschool their kids. So, and even though I have the alphabet soup behind my name, I wrote a book with Dr. Michael Robillard called "Don't Go to College."
That's actually something we push all the same stuff over here. So
yeah, no, I know. That's why it makes sense that we do a lot of these streams together. But I mean, really, you get off the grid in a way. I don't have anything against Rod Dreher. I'm just differentiating. It's not just the Benedict option. If you believe in patriarchy, you believe in subsidiarity. If you believe in subsidiarity and your wife's at home, and if you're blessed enough to have a lot of kids the way I do, you don't need a bunch of cars. You don't need the hellish, dead-eyed suburbanite routine of, your kids going to school for 16 hours a day and then soccer practice and piano practice. And people just hate their lives. It's like, keep your kids, keep your wife at home. Don't send them to school, homeschool them. It takes about 2 hours. The idea of an 8-hour school day is a myth. And yeah, I don't know about accreditation because I have 6 girls, 1 little boy. I won't be sending most of them to college at all. I don't believe in college. It's a scam.
Yeah, amen to that. That's exactly what we say over here. Exactly.
It's a total joke, man. I mean, my co-author, Dr. Michael Robillard, who went on Tucker Carlson's show on it, like the guy's like an Oxford philosopher. He was also a trained Navy SEALs. He's an Army Ranger. He's a base dude. He's like a fighter, pro-am fighter. And he went to West Point. He's super well educated, but he was at places like Notre Dame and Oxford. But he's like, don't go to college. It's a scam. They stood down on the Skittles issue, and we're both trained philosophers, he and I, and we're like, look, once you get academic philosophers, I know you're impressive, Jay, in your knowledge of analytic philosophy. Robillard's always saying that about you, by the way. You have a good handle on it. Once you get analytic philosophers who are supposed to be the muscle men of the academic world, bowing to or doing the ceremonial hand washing to the Skittles changers, the changing Skittles people, whatever you want to call them, that it's over. Academic philosophy is done. Stick a fork in it. So don't go to college. And the nice thing is this means you can have a nice routine. If your wife and kids stay at home, you school them yourself using a classical curriculum or a self-written curriculum. So education is the third prong of what we do. Educate for the virtue of the individual, not to go to college. We advocate trade schools and getting married young, right out of high school if you can. And then the fourth one is right-wing community organizing, which is my second book, Rules for Retrogrades. It's 40 rules to counteract Saul Alinsky's 13 rules for radicals. So those are the 4 kind of positive things that my channel stands on. So they're informed by my Roman Catholicism, but they're not necessarily Catholic specific. A lot of overlap with what you do here.
Yeah, I would remind people too that if you're interested in the history of Western philosophy course that I just taught, that fits into this model, which we think, me and my buddy Richard Grove and I think is the future of education, will be people choosing education on their own via the freedom of the marketplace of ideas, so to speak. I know that's a libertarian phrase, but I think it really does exist in the sense of you can choose to get a comparable education, which is not accredited But I don't think that's really going to matter in the near future as we approach the whatever kind of new weird quasi dystopian world we're going into. I don't think accreditation is going to matter as the legacy institutions become less and less relevant. So there's the link for that if you want to get my History of Western Philosophy course. It's about 32 hours of material, and we are almost finished with the tutoring session this season. So I think next season, I'm going to teach a class on, I don't know if I want to redo Tragedy Hope or if I want to do a geopolitics course, but we're going to do one of those two. So you can get that at the Autonomy Agora Marketplace right there. Our sponsors, as you guys know, are, of course, Chalk.com, and we'll go to the Super Chats here in a second. So Chalk is, of course, the best for red-pilled men to get toxic masculinity points going off the charts. I know a lot of you out there are infected with the disease of soy men, and these pills will get rid of your soy men. I guarantee they will flush the soy out of you, especially the Tonkatali. That's my favorite. It is a peer-reviewed. You can read about the research over there at choqchalk.com. It is peer-reviewed. They show that it is actually able to boost testosterone. So don't take more than one. I've taken 2 and I couldn't sleep all night. Don't take 2. Try out taking 1. If you're a guy, you're a girl, you don't know which ones to get. If you go over to chalk.com, you can conveniently notice the stacks, convenient stacks that they have listed for men and for women. And use a promo code J50, that's JAY50, JAY50 to get 50% off any of those products, including the 7 Wonders. Again, adapted as a make up for our nutrient deficient diets. You can get the Action 2.0, great for boosting energy. You can get the Chocolate, which you see behind me, which is basically a superfood, great for your smoothie regimen in the morning, if that's what you do in the morning. I don't know. Maybe you eat corn puffs or whatever the kibble is that Klaus Schwab wants you to eat. Well, over here, we don't eat the diet that Klaus Schwab says. We are bigots, as Tristan says. We're bigots with our diet, with our mouth. And so we eat chalk.com. So head on over to chalk.com. Use the promo code J53Life, that's JAY53LIFE, to get 53% off recurring subscriptions. That way, you don't have to put the information in every week. And I want to shout out to my buddy Scott Mannion. We did a show last night, also a quasi-show sponsor. So follow Scott over on YouTube and go to Grand Theft World over on Rockfin and follow our buddy Richard Grove. One of those excellent 7-hour podcasts just came out, I noticed, I think Sunday night. So go check out his recent 7-hour update and follow Grand Theft World over on Rockfin. You can also follow on YouTube as well. They put out little clips on YouTube, but the main focal point is, of course, Rockfin, and you can follow me on Rockfin as well. Also, you could get my book that I put out. Well, I didn't actually put it out. The funny story is that somebody else put this out, so I said, all right, whatever. So 600-page book of all my writings of geopolitics, philosophy, and theology. Signed copies at the shop. Jay's Analysis. Head on over there in the shop. You'll notice my books there. And yes, all the copies are signed. Everybody, every day, somebody says, are they signed? Are they signed? Yes. That's why you get them from my website, not from Jeff Bezos. Okay, Jeff Bezos, he's not going to sign it. If he does, it's not going to look like me. It's going to look like, crazy writing or whatever, robot writing, whatever he is made of. I don't know. But I will sign it and it'll be authentic. Let's go to the Super Chats. We got John for $1. Do you have any thoughts on 1066? No, that's yesterday. Excuse me. James Cotarides, $5. Jay, I'm Orthodox. I'm interested in Second Temple literature. Do you know about the Book of Enoch? Yes, I'm familiar with the Book of Enoch. I've read the Book of Enoch. What are your thoughts on it? In my view is that of course, for the Orthodox Church, it's not strictly speaking canonical, but we're not worried about it because we don't have a problem with there being legitimate tradition outside of the the codified canon of Scripture. So we're a church that believes in tradition, oral tradition, and even written traditions outside of the text, which could also have been oral at one point. So, the Book of Jude quotes the Book of Enoch. Sure, no problem for us because, again, there's tradition outside of these texts. Other, post-apostolic era texts were also influential on the liturgy. They were influential on some of the Marian theology in the early church. So there's no problem with the Book of Enoch being cited by Jude or us saying that there are legitimate traditions that speak of these things that don't necessarily make the book part of the biblical canon. So that's my take on that. Tim, if you want to, you're welcome to comment on the Book of Jude or Book of Enoch if you want to. These are questions from, I don't know if they're for me or for everybody. What does it matter? Any comments on that? Okay.
No,
Uh,
no, I don't know enough. Yeah.
Augustus, $10. Jay, looks good. Your hair looks good. That's what we want to talk about. That's what we came here. We're not here to talk about Gabe Lincoln. We're here to talk about my hair, dude. That's what we're here to talk about. And by the way, Tim, I was like, he's got some pretty cool, long hair there. I'm gonna have to top it. So this is gonna be a giant, like David Allen Coe bush that's gonna grow out of my head, and then we'll have to have a hair fight or something. I don't know.
Sounds
But
sweet.
Augustus says this is straight up arugula spicy salad. Uh, okay, I'll take that. Lote din $1. Are we gonna ignore or someone going to listen to? Wait, are we going to ignore that someone can talk and listen to Jay, the destroyer of all bad arguments, and maintain a false worldview? So I think he's saying how can Tim have his worldview and I not destroy his arguments or something? Because it wasn't an argument debate stream. We were here to just have conversation, and I think we pretty much agreed on most of the topics that we covered tonight. So tonight wasn't an area where we were focusing on disagreements or anything like that. Not a debate stream. It was an interview. Luke, $10. Do you have any chance, by any chance, have you looked at Mauro Biglino and his works as a translator, publishing at the House of the Vatican, and he published a book stating that the Word of God in the Bible, as well as other words, are referring to a man with technology. No, I have no idea what that. I'm not trying to be mean to you. I just have no idea what that means. Don't know who Mauro Biglio is. Biglino, sorry. With your spirit, $5. Please ask Tim Gordon. What about Operation Gladio? Is it not very well known in the circles of the Roman Catholic Church? It seems to be influences of intelligence operations via the spheres of Roman Catholicism, and sometimes this is ignored. For example, there is influence of USSR, the Communist Party, but this is overstated. What about intelligence in terms of the Vatican, in your view, Tim? Not a trick question, it was an actual question.
Yeah. Remind me what Operation Gladio is. That's the
Gladio is the Cold War era stay behind units that the CIA trained to kind of be cells that would supposedly fend off any Stalinist invasion of Europe. And so the idea was that these paramilitary guys would basically be trained in sabotage, assassinations, all these kinds of things.
Yeah, I don't know tons about it. It's a big catch term. I've looked into it like twice, and I forget what the question was.
The question? Let me see. The question was, why do you think Gladio is not more well known in Roman Catholic circles? What about the influence of Western intelligence in terms of the Vatican? And does this not suggest that the USSR and communist infiltration and subversion is overrated or overstated?
I don't know. I'd have to think about that one. I'm looking it up right now. I mean, it's hard to say whether or not the influence is overstated when I was like, admittedly, I don't know tons about it. It's a cool sounding name, you know. I'll have to get back to you on that one. That's the most.
Okay, well, that was the question from With Your Spirit. So next question, Rachel Wilson, $5. Thank you both for this fascinating historical insight and for both of the beautiful long hairs. Yes, exactly. He's got me beat on hair right now, but I'm going to catch up one day. Appreciate that, Rachel. Brock Frieden, $3. The pontifical councils possess a diplomatic immunity in the United States. They often appoint lawyers in an effort to issue kickbacks to judges and lawyers involved in retaliatory cases. Teresa Collett served on the Pontifical Council for Family. I don't know anything about this. Do you know about this?
I don't. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not just trying to punt. So this is why super chats are cutting edge. Speaking of Gladio, right? It's a two-edged sword, because you're like, sometimes they're not that relevant. But I need to learn. I need to go refresh.
I did a couple talks on Gladio. If you're interested in the topic,
I'll check them out. I do like your stuff on these false flag operations and stuff. I need to
Stephen
check it
Young,
out.
$1. What do you guys think of the Abu Dhabi thing? Oh, you're talking about Francis's multi faith house. Well, I've done a whole video on it, so you can watch the video I did on the Abu Dhabi Faith Center. I think I did two videos actually on that. Is it perennialism? I would say it's a kind of perennialism, but more of a syncretism, in my view. That is in my view, it's really just a tool for kind of the geopolitical push for the not just the one world state, but that will need a one world religion to go with it. So I'll let Tim comment what he thinks about it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I disagree what you're just saying, that your characterization of it there. I would just, what does one do? And I mean, the Francis Pontificate poses this question for Catholics of goodwill. What does one do when the four corners of a document don't capture all the what's called in law peril evidence, extra stuff that might modify, extra qualifiers that might modify those particular lines of ink between those four documents? Francis has become masterful at, he's perfected the art of post-conciliar adding peril evidence by talking about it, reshaping it out loud, what appears in the four corners of the document. The Abu Dhabi statement did not stipulate that God wills the plurality of religion with his permissive will only, right, rather than his wise will. And that's really important. That's a stipulation.
Well, I don't know if they meant. I wasn't. Maybe I misunderstood. I thought they were talking about the multi faith house, the three faith house there, but maybe they're talking about the joint declaration thing that he signed with the imam. I'm not sure.
I took it either way. It's kind of the same in either case.
Yeah, well, they built that building, I think, on the basis of this joint statement, this signed paper or whatever.
Yeah, it's syncretistic out the wazoo for sure, and it's nothing but bad. It makes you, wish maybe an apparition like Garabandal is true, and maybe he's not Pope. I think he probably is, and then we're just, it's something that's going to have how much syncretism that's not in a four corners document. Same principle applies, that he's giving lip service to or doing something, verbal actions, like St. Augustine talks about, having this crazy syncretism with not even Christian religions. How much of that can be tolerated? It's a distinction of degree, and we don't know. He's currently stretching the magisterium, testing them, kind of shit testing the magisterium right now, like every day, every week. I know you guys.
So you mentioned Garabandal. Again, I'm not trapping you. It's not a debate. Is that one that you accept, or maybe it's just sort of unclear, or no, or what's your take on some of those, like the Bayside and Garabandal and all that?
Well, I just did a show on it, and I'm just kind of looking into it. I always blew it off. I'm no longer blowing it off, and I've kind of mentioned it.
Now, is that just Garabandal or any of them?
No. I love the apparitions, but that one the church is agnostic on. Right there, those three designations the church herself can give. Kind of plus, thumbs up, no comment.
So what about like Bayside, Medjugorje?
Medjugorje, the church is all but given a thumbs down to. Garabandal is the middle one. Fatima is the classic example of it's given the thumbs up. Garabandal is just, because I don't want to dodge this question because I didn't really know enough to answer the other two. It's interesting because it is, if true, and it's very falsifiable, which is satisfyingly specific, right? If it's true, then we will know within 10 or 20 years, because the seer Conchita says, call me out if this doesn't happen in my lifetime. If it's true, it would have implications that were delegitimizing to the pontificate of Francis. But so I think to answer this question, just to come full circle, I would say that when Bishop Athanasius Schneider called out Pope Francis on the statement, if that's what the super chat was asking about, Francis added that peril evidence. So put this in there. Yeah, I meant God's permissive will, which will permit something evil like the multiplicity of religions. Okay, well, you didn't say that. And I think he's kind of apparatchik that's masterful at throwing in statements like that peril verbally after the fact, so that he can do the subversive work on the page, but then technically say, well, it's not officially subversive. I don't know what that does to the state of the magisterium. And in all candor, it's got to be fun to be Orthodox in this time period. You can just point and kind of laugh. I mean, I would if I were
Well,
you,
I
but
think that
our majesty.
I think
Not that you're doing
there's
that.
unique problems. So it's like,
Yeah.
Orthodoxy has its own set of problems that are different from the problems in the world of Roman Catholicism, and there's some overlap because both obviously have liberals and people that are really seeking to change the morals of the institution and all that. But on another level, it's kind of like it's like weird different problems. But what about it's not a trap, but no, what about Bayside? Like that's one of the other famous apparitions. Is that one that you don't know, con? What's your take on that one?
Yeah, that's one I've always blown off, but I've been since I've gone back into Garabandal, and it seems to have more sea legs than I thought. I was considering taking another look at Bayside, but yeah, wouldn't be able to tell you right now.
Interesting. All right, well, guys, anything you want to leave us with before we close it out? I kept you for a little longer than we thought, but hey, it was a great chat. I really appreciate you coming on, and we did like 2 hours instead of 1 hour and a half. But
Fine.
yeah, what are you going to be covering on your channel in the next week or two?
So I am doing more of these with Father Alex Crow, a young based priest out of Mobile, Alabama. He's been coming on my show, and we've been going back through these apparitions. So if anyone wants to see my opinion on them, informed by Roman Catholicism, we're doing those in the upcoming weeks. We did just do a Garabandal one a week or so ago. I think last Monday. And it's I think we're worth revisiting. I haven't gone through and done Marian apparitions shows since my days like 4 years ago with Taylor Marshall. So I'll see what's there in some of the ones that I've spent less time on. Also tomorrow I'm having on Hadley Arkis. We'll be talking more about these things. I think he and I will agree less. It's funny because I think he's Catholic. I think he and I will agree far less than you and I were tonight. And I do 3 shows a week, generally Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Sometimes they modify, but I really do enjoy doing the shows with you. And your show is one of the few YouTube shows that I watch with even semi-regularity, Jay, for all the Catholic content that's out there. I get a lot out of your
appreciate that. Yeah, we try to keep it, diverse. We practice diversity and inclusion over here by not getting bored with the same old topics over and over. So as you guys know, you can always get geopolitical stuff, movie stuff, and now we've done 2 history streams. So last night was history stream, tonight's history stream. So a lot of fun, a lot of cool stuff. Thank you for coming on, and